Hello, everybody. Terrific to be here with you tonight. I'm Joe Treaster, a reporter and foreign correspondent with the New York Times for many years. I'm now a professor at the University of Miami. I'm delighted to be here with Irene Quayle from Germany and Pavel Antonov from Bulgaria. We are grateful to the European Journalism Center for bringing us all together. I've been in and out of your sessions all day today, and I see you've been very animated, and I hope that's the way this session will go. We are on the screen with us, as you know, are the students from the University of Miami. We want this to be a free-flowing conversation with all of you, and we'll start off with a little bit about how we cover climate change and the environment. And we want you to jump in and at any point with questions. So don't hold back and don't expect to hear from us a lot of long discussion. We're going to have a few thoughts, and we want to hear your thoughts. So my colleague Pavel Antonov has lots of experience in broadcasting, magazines, that kind of journalism, and also new media. Irene Quayle is a longtime correspondent for Deutsche Welle. Now, Pavel came up with a wonderful research idea that the European Journalism Center seems to like, and I wonder if Pavel could say a few words about that, and then he'll toss it back to me, and we'll start our conversation.
Thank you, Joseph. Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to make a very brief announcement about this idea, and it is about the fact that we would like to use this opportunity, the presence of all of you here, to actually learn things from each other. And we're certainly not myself, are not here in the position to tell you things about how you do your job as journalists. We are all journalists here, but we would like to use your voices and your thoughts, and this session will be recorded, and this is something you should be aware of. Of course, if someone who is here in the room would not like the things you want to say or contribute to be used for any analytical purposes, it's your choice. You just let us know, and we will not use anything you say. But you please speak up, because what we want to do is work with the recording of the session and analyze it a bit and come up with something that would give some direction and suggestions to the European Journalism Center in their future work. Thank you. Yes, thanks for reminding me. There is an online questionnaire which you may have heard about, and I would very much ask you to spend some time, perhaps 10 minutes on it, and complete it as much as you can. That would also help us a lot. Thank you. Joe.
We've all been working in the area of climate change and the environment for some time. We thought we might start off by talking a little bit about how we do the job, what our perspective and way of looking at the issues and dealing with them. Very briefly, I think Irene will start off, and we're on our way.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joe. Can I just say, for starters, you said I come from Germany. Originally, I come from Scotland, so if you think my accent is not just as German as it might be, then that's the explanation for that. I work for Deutsche Welle. I'm not sure whether people in the room are familiar with Deutsche Welle. It's Germany's, yeah, that's nice, okay, international station. So that means covering climate change. For us, it's a very challenging task because we have a very diverse target groups. We are broadcasting for some people in the developing world who may be feeling direct impacts of climate change or not. Also people in the industrialized world where we feel we've made a considerable contribution to causing climate change, and also to people in, I think, key countries like Brazil, India, or China, transition economies. So another thing you mentioned, that we've been working on this topic for quite a long time. I've seen a major change in that when I started to report even on environment issues, this was a niche topic. These days, environment and climate change are mainstream topics. That makes a difference I find insofar as it also means that we're competing for the news agenda. So like just now, if you want to get a climate topic onto the air, you're competing with Libya, the developments in the Arab world, with the disaster in Japan and so on, so that makes that a lot more difficult. I find in my experience that the key is to try to make the topic relevant for the target groups. So people have to think either this affects me and or there is something that I can do about it. If they just think, oh, climate change, yes, well, so what, then you've lost. The other thing I think for journalists, I work not so much in news, frontline current affairs, but more in background. So there are specialist programs like environment magazines, science magazines that it's ultimately all about finding a good story to tell. Because if people are not interested, then they're not going to listen. Back at Copenhagen, you know, remember we had all the hype, we had loads of interest in climate, we had plenty of stories, people wanted to listen. After that, things got very difficult. So I have to resort to things like, for instance, recently I was at a conference about climate change in the Arctic. Arctic tipping point is also another EU project. Now, how does that affect the rest of the world? You know, initially then my colleagues say, oh, Arctic, another Arctic story. Arctic scientists will not make it into the program. But then, just as just one example, I also interviewed at this meeting some sailors who had been the first last year to sail through the northeast and the northwest passages in one season. And I talked to them, and they told me directly about doing that, what it felt like, and also about the changes that they had seen, even just within the last 10 years. All of a sudden, the colleagues who decide what is going to go on Facebook, what are we going to tweet, were suddenly interested. Sometimes I think it is just about finding an angle which will get people interested. Then you can get the science, you can get the politics in there, but first of all, you have to attract the attention.
Exactly. We'll hear more about that, but Pavel, tell us the way you cover the issues.
If I'm allowed, I would actually just very briefly tell you the kinds of things that I've wondered about when I've covered climate and environmental change generally, but also in the last 2 years since I started actually researching and studying how other journalists cover it. I remember myself very clearly sitting in a television newsroom many years ago, and basically trying to come through with a story about environmental issues, and my editor telling me, oh, come on, that's enough, get us something more serious, we want real news here. And then later on, I was editing this environmental magazine based here in Budapest, and obviously in this job, I was supposed to cover climate change. This was part of the whole mix of stories. But this was a specialized magazine, so I kept constantly wondering, all of this technical language, all of these issues that I'm writing about and dealing with, does this make sense to anyone else but a narrow circle of knowledgeable people? So this was my second question. And last year, already in my capacity of a researcher, I was in another television newsroom, and I was watching What Makes News from Copenhagen. This was actually December 2009. And what I noticed, of course, this was the international news story about a big international conference. Will Obama will be there? Will he arrive or not? What will happen? What's the deal? And all that ran through. And then there was this very interesting aspect which popped up in the last minute, which was ClimateGate. Ooh, climate science may be corrupt, maybe something's wrong. It was a big scandal. And the only local Bulgarian angle what I saw in this television newsroom was when the Bulgarian Prime Minister appeared for a few seconds on the screen and said to the national audience, we managed to get a very good deal. We are only paying a few thousand euros. Others are giving millions. And so this is how this important story was played by a national television channel. And so this made me wonder and even further get interested in what is it that could get journalists more interested in these issues. Thank you, Joe.
Great. Well, I at the University of Miami, I edit an online magazine called onewater.org. And our approach is very similar to Irene's. We try to tell the story of climate change and the environment through people. The focus is always on people and how they and their lives relate to these issues. We find that readers are more likely to read a policy story if we put it in terms of people. So we'll go out and find wherever our story, we cover the world. We have reporters in Africa, China, Latin America, all in various parts of Europe, but mostly developing world. And whatever policy story we want to write, we go and find people and see how they are relating to this policy. And then we have a story in which you have Madam Jones in whatever village or whatever place is doing this, that, and the other thing. And what she's doing relates directly to this policy issue. And then, so we are in the business of writing strong narrative articles that don't seem the least bit technical. In fact, we avoid all technical terms and we try to explain it as if we were talking to someone's grandmother. And the important thing is to make it feel like a good story, a good read. So that's our approach. And Irene, you wanted to tell us about some experience you'd had around the North Pole.
Well, not quite around the North Pole, but you know, as you said, it's about telling a good story. It has to appeal to the people who are listening. And if I said that, you know, at Deutsche Welle that is challenging, this experience, this little story that I'd like to tell you, just showed to me how very lucky I am in a journalist working for the medium for which I do work. I was traveling in Alaska with a group of young people from Europe who were called climate ambassadors. They had won an award, if you like, for projects devoted to improving the environment and drawing attention to climate change. So we were going to visit the research station, the Arctic Research Station in the northernmost point of the United States at Barrow, and also find out how indigenous people in that part of the world were actually experiencing climate change and what they thought about it. Now, these young people were also working for their own projects while we were traveling. And one of them, a young Spanish lady, was planning to draw attention to the fact that while in her home country, in Spain, there is a water shortage and that they're worried about increased droughts, in the Arctic, she said, there is plenty of water because the ice is melting. This was her, if you like, her basic narrative. So we knew that this was somewhere on the agenda. Now, the only other journalist traveling with us during the whole of this trip, which was 2 weeks, was a guy from a British tabloid, and the website of that paper. So I must admit, it sounds a bit snooty, but at the beginning I thought, oh, this will be interesting. You know, what is he going to do with the material and how is he going to cover climate change? So every night we would sit there. Actually, it was very educational for me because we'd sit there, I'd have my story ready, I'd write the blog, we'd upload it, and then he would say, Irene, what am I going to do? How on earth am I going to sell melting permafrost producing methane to my editors? It is just not sexy. He said, if it has nothing to do with belching cows or something like that, then we can do it. But yeah, so when are we going to get the Spanish girl? When is she going to strip off? I said, Sebastian, do we have to have sex in it? Yes, sex sells, he said. This will get my readers, you know. So then I said, what are you going to do with it? The girl herself was very wary of this. She said, ooh, I don't want him to be there when I do my bikini thing. And then he said, if I write, sexy senorita melts the Arctic, is that going too far? So then I said, yes, I think that is going too far. You know, what message are you going to get across? Ultimately, I followed it up. When I got back, he did the story. I mean, I used the same picture which I had taken, and he had taken it, this attractive girl floating amongst the icebergs. But he used a picture where you couldn't see that she was actually wearing a bikini, number one. And the headline of his little article, which of course was just a shorty, was, nice maiden, N''ice, nice maiden's naked plight. So then I ask you, the question is, how far do you go when it comes to getting your story about climate change into your particular medium? I'd be interested in your experiences too. Does this guy afterwards, if he mentions briefly, yes, she is concerned about the Arctic ice, is that going to get a message across? If he does get a message across by using methods like that, and he can reach the mass medium, I mean, in some ways, I felt envious because, these publications really reach the masses, where we are perhaps more specialized, more of an elite. But the question is, how much of that message is still left?
So tell us, who out here can talk about how did
the Spanish lady ended up naked?
Yes, this is the thing, is that she was not naked. This, I'm sorry.
No.
Would you like to tell us your name or you?
It's Raul Kazan, 2 Celsius Network. From Romania.
From Romania. Yeah,
the
please, everyone, when you pick up the mic, tell us who you are and where you're from, country and publication, or whatever your journalism process is. Okay. So, would you just for the we're trying to have a record of this recorded. So say your question again, and we'll start again.
Oh, that's not a serious one then.
It was a wonderful.
I was eager to know how
Now
did
you have to make it serious.
You have to look up. No, I would.
Okay, it's really, really serious. Like
Every question
how
is serious.
did a Spanish journalist, lady journalist, ended up naked at the North Pole? That's
Right.
amazing.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Of course, the thing is, A, that she was not naked; she was wearing a bikini.
Ah, bikini.
B, she was all, but it was made, in my mind, it was manipulated to make it sound like she is naked. So she was quite upset about this because it was not about being naked, but her point was, actually, on the other pictures you see a plastic dinghy, girl in bikini floating amongst the icebergs, and her idea to get across the message that the Arctic is warming much faster than the average rate of the rest of the planet, then that was her idea, but not, that she wanted to be a
It was
sex
warm, so
symbol
she
in
had to
some
have a bikini
website,
on
so-
naturally. And as I understand it, the fellow cropped the picture so that you couldn't tell she
No,
had a
well,
bikini.
he didn't crop it. It was just the angle.
You just couldn't see
that
the bikini.
you just couldn't
You
see
could
the
imagine
bikini. You
she
could
was
see she was
without
wearing
clothes,
garlands
but
and
she
things
was.
like
Maybe we
this,
get
so-
back to the question.
But
Exactly.
The
So-
point is
question
just
is-
how is it?
How do you sell your stories? to all
Yeah,
editors?
who wants to talk about that? Well, here we are. Microphone's coming your way.
Hello, my name is Dalila Ngoskati. I'm from Lithuania and I'm working for a news agency. I like very much the former BBC editor Alex Kirby, who is speaking about that entertainment and producing of news, serious news, is a very different thing. And I think it's an example that to show a naked woman and to talk about this problem seriously is a very different point. That we when we read New York Times, we expect to read different news and not about naked women on the iceberg. Yeah. And what is that very really strange thing for me to hear from all of you? I know that this is journalist ABC, that you must to speak for people and in the people language. But I thought when we were working in such media source as Deutsche Welle or New York Times, you can speak it more about general thing and about global thing. And
Actually, the more we learn, you will read the New York Times front page any day of the week, and you'll find out that the more specific, the more compelling the story. So we find very little readership for broad, sweeping, introductory stories. Instead, look at the Middle East coverage. Mohammed Shaziz said today this, that, and the other thing, or it's always very personalized.
Okay, then I must cover climate change, and
Yes.
I know that a big part of Lithuanians doesn't care that some people are feeling thirst. I must that they don't have water or something else thirsty. Yeah. I must read that their clothes to write that their clothes will be prices will be higher because like cotton is getting higher because like it's getting climate change and because ice is melting and because.
You can make that a personal story right there. You can have someone going to buy a piece of clothing that's out of cotton and talking about how the prices.
I'm doing
and you
like
do
that. But when I'm reading New York Times, I think that you work differently. Maybe.
Well, no. I mean, the idea of the New York Times is to impart big and important issues in a very digestible way. So I just refer you to the website or to the front page any day. The stories do not have this kind of grand distancing effect to them. them, but they are all, many of them, I'd say 2 or 3 a day. We can get 6 stories on the front page. 2 or 3 every day will be of this human nature sort of thing, and with a policy message.
Yes. No, there are 2 more people who want to speak from the audience.
Yeah, are you going to be the moderator?
I'm Vanya Walker-Lee from the Malta Business Weekly. I think the greatest problem is to educate the editors and also the financial or other groups who actually own many newspapers and other media. Their goal is profit. They are not like the campaigning newspaper editors of the 19th century. So how do you educate these people about the seriousness of the climate change problem
Pavel,
and the
why don't you
urgency
answer
for
that?
action?
Can you deal with that? How do you educate the editors?
Actually, I can't deal with it. Actually, I think it's a very good question, and it's a very important question. And the issue you're pointing here is quite essential. It's about the ownership of mass media being part of the global economy, basically, and journalists being much more aware of where they belong, the interests of their employers, the political and economical situation they live in, and so on. And so I'm curious to hear from everyone here whether these kinds of arguments transpire in your everyday work.
Yeah, let's hear more on that.
Can I perhaps, until we have another point there,
yeah.
Can I just say that I agree. One of the key insights, if you like, for me in traveling with this colleague was just how very different it is if you are working for a medium which is profit-oriented, which is commercial. And that's where I think, public broadcasters like Deutsche Welle, like others, like BBC, we have a different background, we have a different task, the conditions are different, whereby I think the pressure is increasing, like you also mentioned Alex Kirby. The pressure is increasing to move more towards what the others are offering, because that is the competition. But I still think that there is a huge difference between being a public broadcaster and working for a medium, whether it's radio, television, or a print medium, which is commercial and ultimately has to give people what the readers are, what's going to sell, basically. Catastrophe sells, sex sells.
Yeah, I think the instincts of the publishers and the editors is to provide things that people want to read. And so the burden on reporters is to take your serious subject and find a way that everybody would want to read about it. If you look at some academic journals and some serious environmental publications, you're almost certain that many people are not going to want to read those, but that specialists would read them, and perhaps we would read them and then find ways to interpret them so we can get a mass audience. So, I prefer not to think of myself as fighting with the editors and publishers, but trying to think of ways to work with them, since I know what their motive is to get information to the public, and I know that what my subject is very important. So now I have to think of, well, how can I make people not be forced to read this, but want to read it? So, Pavel?
I'm very happy to take up from here, but I would be happy if the people who wanted to express their opinions
of course.
would
Anybody
speak up
else
now.
There was a lady here in the front.
That's fine. We'd love to hear your thoughts, though.
I am very happy.
Yeah, the lady in the purple.
Here, thank you.
Yeah, Odile Harvey from France, but I'm Brussels-based. I have that experience that I was asked by one of the publications I work for to focus on EU defense policy and all the aspects of it. Having all the which in the editor views was very important. And even though some of the publication is distributed to the MEPs and not by subscriptions, but they thought that it was was going to be the central issue, and then so I had to really have a little bit of a sweet fight with them to say, well, you can't, we've got to have another topic, and so I suggested we cover the EU Development Days and interview 3 African leaders, and but it was really very, very difficult to get that along, and especially that the leaders leaders didn't show up in Stockholm for various reasons, draft in either in Burkina Faso and political problems, etc.
Right.
So, it's
what-
not so easy.
Could you just summarize the problem you're telling us about and how you solved it?
Well, the way I solved it, first of all, I said, well, perhaps I could send questions ahead of time, asking them for 1,500 characters, each of them. I thought that there would be someone in their cabinet, who would be able to write about 1,500 characters. And adding the three of them, I would have enough for, one page. And then they got worried. They told me, well, what if they're going to give you 3,000 characters each, you have to cut and all this. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And but we'll have too much. And I said, don't worry, I lived in Africa for 4 years. My inclination is that probably I'll go to Stockholm, we'll have nothing. And that's exactly what happened, and for various reasons. And then it was a struggle to get one of the leaders, the only one present, a woman, and to get the information from her because she was so busy and all this. Yeah. But in the end, I managed. But it was quite a fight.
Fantastic.
I can tell you.
It's an interesting case. Now,
yeah.
I saw some other hands out here. Over here on the left, thank you very much.
And there is someone behind the camera hiding.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Yeah. I would like to say something. I mean, I feel that in the last years, discussions that in the past were about air pollution, the risk to health of nuclear facilities, all kinds of subjects, dozens of subjects, hundreds of subjects, have been kidnapped by the climate change debate. I'm let's say semi-septic, something like that. But I mean, there are hundreds of subjects we could talk about without referring to climate change. They are in our interest as citizens or companies or governments to do something about it now, whether there is a climate change or not.
Right.
And I feel that we are complicating our relation with readers, with viewers, with listeners, if we try to refer all these local, regional, or European discussions to the climate change debate. I can explain to citizens anywhere in my country, Holland, or my second homeland, Iraq, what's the local problem with greenhouse gases or air pollution, right. Or so I feel that, well, there are a few areas left where we can only talk to our readers that this is something worth of attention, or to my editor-in-chief, it's worth of attention because of climate change. But I feel that over 90% of these subjects could be dealt with without bothering readers with expert opinions about is this also...
Right. Good. Well,
okay?
I think, it depends on whether you want to talk about climate change and the environment as a worldwide issue, which a lot of people seem to think is a worldwide issue. And a lot of people would probably not think that they were bothering the readers by connecting local issues to the bigger picture. We're all on the same planet, and if there is global change, if there is climate change and there is a huge environmental picture, one way to tell it is to relate the people in the ground at a small place to the bigger picture. If you feel yourself, no, just let me finish. If you feel yourself that it's bothering them, then I would suggest not to write that story, but write one you feel more comfortable with. How do you guys feel about that?
Sorry, just a practical point. Can you say your name for the recording?
Oh yes, thanks.
Anna van Amarooy
from
Holland.
From Holland. Okay.
Yeah.
So, do you all have any thoughts on that? We're still trying to get her question.
I do have some thoughts.
I'm going to ask him his question in a minute.
Okay. I think what you said was very interesting and very provocative in a way. And to explain why, I will tell you how over the last 10 years I've been going around Central and Eastern Europe as part of different teams which deliver trainings to journalists, also the new independent states and further east, different countries, together with journalists from the West, American and English. And we've been basically trying to convey the basic rules of how journalism is done. So usually, in many of these trainings, I've had next to me a good friend now from The Guardian, Paul Brown, who used to be the long-serving environment correspondent. And one of his best advices to everyone was, a good journalist can make everything an environmental story. And if you don't want your editor to say no to a story, don't mention the word environment or climate. Just go and say, I have a very good economy story, I have a good transport story. And then when they accept it, then you just say, he even said, I signed environment correspondent, and then everyone knows this was an environmental story. But the point you're making is climate change pops up from every corner. And it's true in a sense, and it may be, and there is some evidence of fatigue on the side of the audiences of the issue coming, and that's true. But the point is, there is this three distinct, more or less distinct areas which determine the way journalists do their job. The first one we touched upon was the market and the economy, the ownership, all of that. There is the second one where there is a significant amount of expectations. This is the classical function of journalists, the fourth estate kind of theory, where journalists have a responsibility to the public to inform, to convey important issues, and to raise awareness. And the last one is this purely professional framework of issues, the rules and the routines and the practices which regulate our work. How do we file a report? How do we do an interview? And all of these things. And what seems to be happening is that the last one is influenced significantly by the previous two, most particularly by the economy one. So basically, even the way we do our job as journalists, we feel the pressure from the economic factor much more and more. And actually, I have a story to tell, but maybe a bit later I can tell this story.
Good. So why don't we, let's have the follow-up question here, and then we'll go back to a question over here. If you would, please.
Final remark, that if I can explain to a local or regional or national audience what's the relation, for example, between air pollution in the port of Rotterdam and the fact that young children with asthma cannot live in the Rotterdam area but have to move 150 kilometers up north just to breathe normally. While if I have to, let's say, discuss pollution in Rotterdam with a reference to climate change science, I have a much harder job as a journalist, because, as Professor Tibor explained this morning, the uncertainties about climate science are 100 times the uncertainties about asthma, about air pollution and asthma, about who is creating this air pollution in Rotterdam and asthma. And we are making ourselves, our lives very difficult as journalists by wanting to refer to the climate change science.
I don't think it's about us making our lives difficult. It's about communicating with our audiences. And so I understand in the case of the uncertainties of climate change, in a story like that, if you think it's valid to make a broad, universal kind of statement, you could say that this may be, many scientists think this may be related to climate change, and say what climate change is, and then go on with it. If you don't think that that is worth talking about, then I think that's a matter between you and your process and your editors. We're not trying to impose here on anybody the idea of how they should do their reporting. I don't think you'd want that, would you? No. So back over here. Sorry. Follow.
I just wanted. I think that before we get maybe lost in some misunderstandings, I can see a common factor there. I think a lot of it is about the language that we use. Like your example just now is you're talking about something that people can relate to easily. You said too that in your stories, Joe, you try to find an example that people can relate to.
Yes.
At the beginning, when I mentioned like the story of the Arctic, I recorded various interviews with scientists who are talking about the albedo effect and radiation and so on. And fine if you're a scientist, and that's okay, but for the ordinary person, Then you find one of these people he's a sailor, he's not a scientist, but he says, yes, well, we're losing the protective shield for the Earth because, you know, the snow is white and it reflects the heat back. When the snow is gone, the water is dark, so it absorbs it and it heats up. He was he puts it into language which ordinary people can understand, which is often the job we journalists have. But if you find someone like that who's charismatic and explains it, then so much the better. And B, he's someone sort of an adventurer, a sailor, who appeals to certain instincts. So I think it's about finding the examples and the language that people can relate to. And the other thing I just wanted to mention is that I don't know, maybe some of you here heard about a recent study in the USA, and it was about climate skeptics and why do people not believe in climate change. And it said that actually it depends on the wording. If you ask the same people whether they believe that climate change is happening and is man-made, a higher percentage will say yes than if you say, do you believe in global warming? Then they say, global warming? No, it's not getting warmer. We had a cold winter or whatever. But that it's just a question of terminology. And they had a lot of statistics that this study showed that just those differences in terminology, especially within certain politically minded groups, made all the difference when it came to whether they, believed that this was happening and that we could do something about it.
So, that's great. And another question here in the back.
Yeah, Willy de Backer. The guys here in Budapest know me because I was moderating the whole day, but for the students in Miami, let me present myself. First, I'm an independent journalist working on climate issues, energy, agriculture, transport, so what I call sustainability in general. What I want to say is probably even a bit more provocative than what was said before. I think we need to look into our own hearts as journalists, because Irene, the story that you tell us and the question that you actually then provoke is, how do we reach big audiences? Reaching big audience has to do with commercial interests. Mm-hmm. For me, the role of a journalist is historically to be the conscience, not to sell. Right? So that's a big point that I would like to make. I think we have to rethink our role as journalists. And I know it's difficult. You have to make a living, etc., etc. But on the other hand, I set up my own online news service, but I already on my news service felt the commercial pressures in a way. That's why I left at a certain point, to be independent, to be more able to say what I needed to say, which I couldn't do because of the commercial constraints that I was under. And I think it's important for all of us to think about our role as journalists again at a time when we're facing so many challenges. I think we have an enormous role to play, and we should not just be too fatalistic and say, okay, there's these commercial pressures, so we have to think about how I can sell that to the guy in, I don't know, the little town there or this or whatever. For me, a journalist can sometimes also make a story which doesn't reach the average person, the average Joe in I don't know where, but which reaches then some of the policymakers that might want to rethink some of their policies. Just let me give you one example. Peak oil is now a debate which is on, I would say, the political agenda. It is a story that was developed not by journalists, it was developed by bloggers. So, and there I come to a very important aspect, which I would like to hear from the three guys at the panel there, the role of, what we now call citizens journalism.
Yeah.
If you don't take up the role of being the conscience, well, these guys will do it. I actually stepped down as editor-in-chief of Euractiv, because at some point I said, I can't say what I want to say. I want to be able to do that. Therefore now I started a blog, I started to tweet, etc., etc. And I'm reaching the people that I need to reach. And they listen to me, and they listen to my questioning, and sometimes to my pessimistic stories. But I think it's a role that we journalists need to play again. So I know the commercial interests are there, but please, as journalists, take up your responsibility, be the conscience of the world. Thanks.
Well, I think in this audience here, we have a lot of people who are blogging and using social media. Who would like to respond to that? No. Here, in the back. Thank you.
I believe in social media also.
We're not hearing you.
I believe in social media also. The problem is, journalists, we have a defect.
A what?
Defect.
A defect. Could you please identify yourself? Just for we need your name and where you work.
Regina Laguna from Spain.
Okay, great. And tell us about the defect.
We need to eat.
We need to eat.
Yes.
Okay.
How? How? Who pays a blogger? Maybe one in the world, maybe 10, but not 10,000 or 100,000. That's the problem.
Well, I mean, there is another side of that. We have many of us have thought of this as sort of a noble calling and have not been motivated by money. I agree, we all have that defect and need to eat. But I think what this speaker, Willie de Backer, is talking about is the opposite of the commercial motive. He's talking about trying to find a way to send material out to an audience that's serious and yet is not driven from the writer and publication point of view by commercial pressures. Now, you know, I happen to have the view that you can do both. I think that if you have a good story, people will come to hear your good story, and I think you see evidence of it every day in the book business. There are terrific nonfiction, strong narrative books about the very sort of things that everybody in this room would like to be writing about and talking about, and they're very well written, and they get a very good audience. And I can tell you there are books that are written that are very important that get an audience of 1,000. So I'm from the school of trying to write the story as best you can, try to get the biggest audience you can, because I think when you have a good idea, you want to influence the rest of you know, you want to influence an audience. So who wants to follow on that?
Yeah,
Pablo.
Thank you for raising this issue. And I will speak here as someone who certainly supports the whole idea behind new media and its powerful law and the internet and its influence. And I have actually worked for over 10 years in this field as well. The thing is, and what I will try to say, I hope I can say it in a way that it kind of makes sense. I very much agree with the point you raised, but I have a very big worry. And my worry is, and it's not my personal worry, but it also comes from a lot of research of journalism, what's happening now. It seems that the traditional journalism domain, where we most of us belong or have belonged at some point, seems to be narrowing down. And the social responsibility functions of journalism that you're talking about seem to be exported to another domain, which is the domain of so-called new or citizen media. But the difference between these two is the citizen media have no structures and no responsibilities in terms of checking their sources, in terms of reading the real paper, the scientific material, and then doing their job properly. So basically, it is a trend which removes this kind of quality work from the journalistic domain, which is why I think we should struggle as journalists, as professionals in our own domain to keep it there, to keep to the requirements of our profession in a quality way and to make sure it is there and not let the other factors kind of push us away. And actually I wanted to give an example of how I was confronted by this for the first time in my life, and it happened outside of the European Union. Sorry about this. It happened on a training I was giving in the Altai Mountains of Russia and we were with a group of journalists, Russian journalists in the glaciers, and we were talking to local experts and local people, and all the journalists were doing their stories. But as part of this training, it was my job also to kind of inform the Russian journalists of the basic ways journalism works in the Western world generally, all these principles of objectivity, checking your sources and all that. By the end of the training, one of the best young journalists who was in love with his job, obviously, told me that after hearing you and after seeing what journalism actually is, I think I'm going to have to quit because I don't believe in this country I will ever be allowed to do good journalism. So, and I thought this was a very shocking experience coming from someone who likes the profession of journalism and really wants to do it in a good way. And this is what I'm actually opening up to you again, the journalists who are present here. Have you been in similar situations? How do you feel your professional profiles, identities are changing at the moment? And have you been in situations to actually struggle or stand certain positions?
Yeah, so let's hear something. I know you had a question in mind before Pavel started talking, but can you talk about that issue, because
exactly.
we'd like to stay right on it.
Two statements. I'm Ulrich Timm from Germany, German television, and in my opinion is with this new media, journalists tend in these times to jump too easily on this information from this media from people that are not educated as journalists. For example, somebody is twittering something and journalists jump on it. We had some of these, you can say, misunderstandings in Germany with German journalism. So they don't double check these things. So they have in mind, this is in a way true, what the public is doing there, so they jump on it. This is one statement. So I think we can use it as professional journalists, but always have to double check this information, not jump easily on it. And just one remark to you, to the commercialization of journalism. I'm in a very lucky position because I'm public television in Germany, so we don't have the pressure of advertising companies and things like that, and so we have a lot of freedom to do journalism, and I know that in the States it's a little bit different. That's a statement for that.
Okay, now I just want to call attention to our folks in Miami. You know, as the conversation has been unfolding, I think it's been very informative for the folks in Miami, but it may not be inspiring any questions. So I know that they're in Miami and they're listening carefully. And if you do have anything you'd like to ask at this point, fire away. And if you don't, we'll keep on with the discussion here. Anything from Miami?
University of Miami. And my question is, in the light of the previous discussion on sort of gray area that exists in trying to find a balance between covering the environment and appealing to readers, what role do you think that objectivity plays, and also at what point does it become sensational?
Okay, Irene, we were hoping you'd ask that. Thank you.
Yes, I think that is, that's a very good question. I'd also like to come back later on some of the other points, but that question of objectivity is a key one, I think. I would ask you, is it actually possible to be objective? Where do we take the information from? With the whole climate debate, there have been people, I think a lot of damage has been done in the past, probably especially in the United States, by the idea that you always have to give both sides of the argument and you always have to give it 50-50. So if your editor says to you, no, you must be objective, every time you have a climate scientist or a politician or somebody from Greenpeace or whoever talking about climate change, you also have to have a climate skeptic who will say this is not happening. If you do that, in my opinion, quite clearly, you distort the picture. Because given that, say, 90 to 95% are the estimates usually given of scientists who say anthropogenic climate change is happening, and the 5% of skeptics, by giving them half the airtime, a lot of media have been distorting the picture. I think the other thing that we have to remember is still the classical rules of journalism. You have to distinguish between reporting and comment. If you are stating your opinion, you have to make that quite clear that that is what you are doing and that you are not trying to be an objective reporter at that point. I think this also applies with blogging. That brings me back to that topic, which I also wanted to mention. I mean, I blog, and when I blog, I am subject to different rules from when I either produce a radio piece or write an online article. Because quite clearly, if I blog, it is my opinion. I don't have an editor. I love to do that because, I mean, I find it's very spontaneous. It can sometimes be very emotional, and it provokes response, and it reaches people that you don't reach otherwise. But I also think that we need the traditional media because, like you said, I mean, sometimes our bosses tell us you should be a trusted guide, that people need to be able to turn to a station or to a newspaper that they rely on, where they know that these people will research the story. If there is another side to it, I mean, fine. We've also, in some ways, we have got to remain skeptical. Like, as journalists, we have to remain open to the fact that there could be new scientific evidence which will change everything that we've known so far. I mean, look for how many centuries we thought the world was flat. So, you know, we can't just say this is it is happening, and, you know, we're not going to listen to anything new. We have to be open for that, but we also have to keep it in perspective, and that too, I think, is where the classical media have a different role to play. I think think bloggers, social media, yes, it's great, and it all has its place.
And Pavel, where you come out on the objectivity issue?
I actually made myself clear, and I was hoping that there would be other people who would want to take up
Well, do it
on the
again,
objectivity
because I think
issue.
we may have
There
missed
is
you.
only one little tiny, probably, detail which I would be happy to share. Perhaps some of you may remember, if you have seen the Academy Award-winning documentary of Al Gore, The Inconvenient Truth. At some point in the documentary, he made a reference to something what is actually a very significant line of research, and it is the finding that in the US, over the last 10 years, through a methodology of content analysis quite well implemented, it was proved that more than 99% of the scientifically published peer-reviewed articles agreed on a certain level of understanding of climate change, which is that it is happening and it is of anthropogenic origin, while at the same time on the mass media, the ratio was something like 50-50, particularly because of the issue of balance, which raises the issue of how do we as journalists follow the rules, and is it possible to actually follow all the rules at the same time? Apparently not, so you have to make choices. And here I stop, because
you have to make choices, exactly, and that's good. This study that was done a few years ago, about the time of the Gore film, and I can say that the mainstream journalists in science and the environment in the United States have now adopted another attitude, which is, well, as Irene says, 99% of the scientists say that there is something happening in terms of climate change, and so we don't have this compulsion to balance 50-50, and as Irene says, we all keep an open mind and don't just blindly keep reporting that there is climate change, but keep once in a while asking some skeptics and make sure your reporting is up to date. But trying to avoid being dogmatic, and trying to report to the reader, after all of your diligent resources, all your effort, the reader should not have to go through all the work that you went through. You tell them, now I've done all this research and here's the way it looks to me. And that's we think is an important part of mainstream journalism. And you document in your article who you talked to and how you heard it and so on and so forth, but you're not compelled to give 50-50 to people who you in your heart, after all your research, don't think have a basis for argument. Here, yes, ma'am. And
this side here is very silent.
Well, we are very short on time, but if we can take a very brief question
just
here.
One very short remark. When I was editor-in-chief of a monthly magazine about science and technology journalism, there was a study proving that in countries like Belgium and Holland, the school books used in secondary education were 20 years behind the scientific facts. In chemistry, in physics, in biology.
That looks
and
to me
something like
that's
that.
an excellent opportunity for journalists, because we're not 20 years behind. We're on the spot. And so if we have this problem, which is common worldwide, it's even worse in some other countries, we've got to function. We can tell people what's happened yesterday.
Yeah. But as you know, we still have to, education still has a long way to go to integrate internet information and news information into the regular curriculum.
I think it's a good point. We're going to be wrapping up here. Here's the last question, and we maybe can take one more very quick question. If somebody over here, Pavel has pointed out, very quiet side of the room. Yes, ma'am.
Last, no question, it's just a comment about what you were saying about the social media, about the objectivity, and what you just say, that our function is to tell the world what happened yesterday. No.
Well, I think it's to tell people, one of the functions
what happened today?
In contrast, well, today, tomorrow, whatever, but it's in contrast to the textbook that's 20 years old.
Yes.
So I wouldn't quibble whether it was yesterday, today, or whatever.
Then what I think is, because we have the traditional media, the objectivity, the double check that somebody else said, what we have to do, the traditional media, is to invite the social media to open forums, to open debates, and to attract the people who only reads and only gets the information by the net.
Well, I think we want as much communication as we can. Do we agree on that?
Yes.
So is there a last question over here?
Now that there are more questions, we have to finish. But let's hear them all at least.
Yeah. Well, we'd love to. Do we have a little? Can we extend a couple minutes now that we have a volley going, or
Yes.
must we?
Yes. If someone is so hungry, they can go ahead.
All right. Or what do you want me? 5 minutes. We're going to have a 5-minute.
I'd just like to make a short comment. My name is Yogi Gotcha from Bulgaria. I think we, as a journalist, face a problem when the science behind climate change is not clear enough, and when there are doubts about the scientific facts. As Pavel said, climate gate really shake the foundations of climate science. But there is one more thing. Last year, I think a German journalist revealed that the prediction in the latest IPCC report that the Himalayan glaciers would melt in 2035 was really exaggerated, and the original prognosis was 2350. And I clearly remember when we published this story, people were really angry, and they were like thinking that this is a global conspiracy, UN, US inspired conspiracy, that there is no climate change, that this little tiny error in 1,000-page report is really shaking the foundation of the...
So the question?
No, this is not a question.
Well,
I'm just saying that we should bear in mind that even scientific reports that are peer-reviewed many times.
Yeah, Irene has been thinking about that and talking with us about it today. Would you talk about that a little?
Yes, just around about the time when that happened, actually the day when that this report came out about the mistake in the Himalayas, we at Deutsche Welle had Professor Adil Najam, who was one of the IPCC lead authors of that report, just happened to be with us that day for a press conference and interview. And he said exactly what you said. It is only a tiny thing in this massive report, one very small mistake, but I think what he agreed on and we agreed on was that it had done huge damage just to the image of climate science that it happened, but also that the media bear a huge responsibility because of the way that happened, because of the way it was covered by a lot of the media. People were really led to have their confidence in climate science shaken where it wasn't justified. And he also said to me at that time, because we were also talking about the climate gate and so on, and he said, I would just like to remind you all, these journalists here in the room, that if it hadn't been for the media, there would have been no climate gate. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't report it, but when it comes to how we deal with it, we can also do an awful lot of harm, and sometimes it develops its own momentum.
Here's another question. Now, if anybody hasn't asked a question, we've got about 2 minutes to go. Fire away.
This is Kostas Geropoulos from New Europe newspaper. I'm from Athens, Greece, but our paper is based in Brussels. One of the most popular stories we ever did was about the politics of climate change. Because, right after the Russians plugged the flag in the North Pole, we did a story called, the hunt for Arctic gas, which was extremely popular on the web and at the paper. So I was wondering, how now we see that climate change is affecting the politics because all the countries now competing for those resources up in the North Pole. And, basically it's becoming more of a political issue as well.
Talk about that.
I don't want to take away time from anybody else who wants to say something, but exactly, I think that is exactly true. Like when I said at the beginning it has become more mainstream, I think the fact that it is on the political agenda, especially the prospect of geopolitical struggles, of conflicts in the north. One of the other Arctic stories that I did, having been at this Arctic event up in northern Norway this year, the other story which everybody wanted to read was that very one about who owns the North Pole, who owns the waters, how far are we towards getting in there and getting hold of the resources. That as soon as you come to big economic concerns or to the possibility of political conflict, I think there is a huge interest on that. But then I think that as an environment journalist, then it's my job also to make sure that the other side gets in there, but that's fine with me. If there is an increasing interest because of the political side to it or the economic side to it, and that gives an opportunity to also get the ecological point of view in there, then, well, we'll make use of it.
I think that's terrific. I think there is no stopping point here. This could go on for quite a long time. We are wanted in the dining room. You've been a terrific audience. The people in Miami want to thank you very much for being with us. And thank you here for inviting the Miami people into this room. Thank you all for your really good, interesting questions. And I look forward to tomorrow with our time with the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Thanks again.